So this is the second class on psychodynamic theory. We'll be wrapping things up here. We have a little bit more flexibility with time today, so if you guys have any questions that you're really curious about as it relates to mental health issues or therapy or personality dynamics or relationship dynamics, this would probably be a good class to go a little bit off script if people are interested in certain things. And yeah, we'll just kind of see how we do here today. So just a brief recap on psychodynamic theory. So it's an approach that emphasizes unconscious, that is non-conceptual, implicit, or pre-thematic phenomena, including unresolved or habitually avoided emotions, as well as that implicit sort of way of understanding relationships and past experiences that may have influenced us. So a lot of this stuff is kind of lines up with attachment theory, some of the things that we've been talking about that play out on more that emotional, intuitive level in terms of how we are situated in the world and how we are oriented toward other people. We talked about transference as being a response primarily to contextual features. It's an emotional or cognitive mode of comportment, directing itself toward. It doesn't have to be in this thematic way. It usually isn't. And it unfolds in response to familiar cues or signs in the environment. They're familiar based on our past experiences and learning. And usually a kind of, not a knowing that, but a know-how, like an implicit intuitive learning. So it plays out in the environment, our being in the world, or within an interpersonal exchange. And usually these intuitive modes of responding, ways of being with others, and the receptivity to different kinds of emotions, it plays out in a way that was adaptive in a prior context, and that kind of fits with the attachment theory that we've been talking about. So we discussed defense mechanisms as a tacit avoidance of overwhelming anxiety or emotion. So there's the anticipation that the experience of some emotion would overwhelm one's ability to cope or function. It's also a way to deal with the anxiety that may anticipate the possibility of this feeling showing up. So again, if you just frame this in terms of our discussions about emotion regulation, so emotion regulation is the ability to be receptive to various moods and emotions and to be able to tolerate them, to be able to, hang out in a particular mood or emotion without being overwhelmed and without having to engage in, various intuitive, implicit strategies to detach from the experience. Okay, so that middle path is what we mean by emotion dysregulation. So an individual who uses a cluster of different defense mechanisms, arguably they have a great deal of difficulty with emotion regulation. And so they're more or less in the business of coping. When we talk about defense mechanisms, I would encourage you to think about or consider the possibility that this is not just a material efficient causal process that's unfolding in response to stimuli or something like that. That's only part of the picture. That in essence, it's kind of like a formal cause phenomenon that's partly in play. So a prior world, a referential totality within which we are always already engaged with. We dwell within that world, that social world, the world of our receptivity to different emotions, how the world shows up as meaningful and so on. All of this and being thrown into a mood, right? We find ourselves in a mood. It discloses the world in a particular way, and we project ourselves into anticipated possibilities and through our ongoing activity. So again, it's a tacit know-how, and so it's not just the effect of what we might consider some neural script or something like that. But again, there's likely material efficient causality, working all the way in the background as well. Another point just that I don't think we mentioned there, but every single individual engages in these sort of defense mechanisms. Like there's not a day that goes by that you or I we do not engage in this sort of thing. So they're just usually it would involve just a very subtle modes of intellectualizing, the kind of being that we are. We have that ability to think symbolically and abstractly and to generalize, and if some of that abstraction helps us detach a little bit from the feeling, then we slide into that mode of being, right? We may engage in little rationalizations throughout the day in the service of maintaining our self-esteem or some distressing emotion that might be an issue for us. So we always, every single person, no one is free of defense mechanisms, arguably, and there's some bigger ones that we'll talk about as we get into the existential sections. But it becomes a problem, arguably, when it becomes so intractable or so entrenched in someone's personality structure that it closes them off to even being able to experience certain kinds of emotions in general, and it leads to various problems that we'll maybe tease out here a little bit more. Any questions about any of that? That's pretty straightforward. So we're going to run through some different defense mechanisms. I thought what would be fun is if I gave like a single hypothetical scenario and then talked about some different ways that a person could engage with defensive kind of maneuvering to deal with the feeling that a person might intuit is overwhelming. So the hypothetical scenario that I'm going to put out there for us to play around with is a scenario where you imagine that we're working in groups, right? And so you guys are coming together in, let's say, groups of like 6 people or something, right? And we're going to say that in this group, you have one person in this group, and we're going to call him Rick. And Rick is an absolute jerk, right? And so he's, doing all the talking. He's just seems to be this narcissistic, just full of himself. And any time that you try to bring something up, like a comment or a contribution of some sort, a suggestion, it's immediately shut down. And it's mocked, and he's rolling his eyes and laughing and getting these little digs in at you and this sort of thing. So we'll play this out as a hypothetical scenario. Now let's say that this is really bothering you, like this is really eating you up inside, but you're not dealing with those feelings very well, okay? So then we're going to say, okay, what would this look like? How could this play out in some different ways? So we could say that one way that a person could, avoid these feelings is just through repression. So it's the unconscious denial of feelings or cognitions that cause anxiety. So that might look like this. So someone in your group kind of catches you in the hallway and they say, oh gosh, look, I don't know how you're finding that thing, but man, Rick is just really giving it to you in these little group sessions. He's just singling you out and just cutting you down, and gosh, I wouldn't want to be in your shoes. That must be really tough. And your response to that is, no, it's fine. I don't have any problem with it. It's perfectly fine. Yep. Anyway, how's this other class going? Right. So quickly change the topic. Now it's repression because you ask the question about it, and immediately all this anxiety starts to come in, and the person isn't aware of the anxiety, and the anxiety is the anticipation of some feeling. Now we might hypothesize that the feeling is, yeah, I feel, kind of small and dejected and, terrible and dismissed and all that other sort of thing. Or the feeling could be just, I'm absolutely irate and pissed off and angry at this guy for doing this, right? So these are the possible feelings, we'll say, that are not showing up. Denial is denying the existence of an external threat or traumatic event. So it's arguably more serious. It's a denial of reality. So you ask the question, how are you doing with this Rick guy? And it's like, Rick who? I don't know what you're talking about. Is there a guy named Rick in our group? I didn't even notice, right? This sort of thing. And again, you see some of this anxiety coming in as the person is denying this. Reaction formation is expressing an impulse that is the opposite of the one that's truly driving the person. So let's say you're absolutely furious with this guy on some level. You're not aware of the anger that is there. And what happens, you come and you meet, on Friday or whatever when you do this group thing, and you show up with these cookies that you baked. And you give him the first pick. Would you like a cookie? I baked these. I thought it'd be really nice. We can sit here and talk about our thing. And why don't you get the first pick? Why don't you take 2? This kind of thing. So it's almost like overcompensating for the aggressive feelings that the person has that they're not acknowledging. Projection in this context is attributing a disturbing impulse to someone else. So, you might actually see Rick in the hallway and pull him aside and say, look, I don't know if you're aware of this, but Sally in our group, she really doesn't like you. She thinks that you're just a narcissistic ass that is just ruining our group. Hate to break it to you. I'm sure that's not easy to hear, but it's true. So you're getting some of that satisfaction of some aggressive impulse, but you're imagining that as being manifesting within another person, so it's indirect. Rationalization is reinterpreting behavior to make it seem more rational or acceptable or less threatening. So again, someone asks you about how you're doing with this and so on, and your response is something like, well, there's a wide range of people out there in the world, and some people are irritable and narcissists and kind of mean and whatnot, and who knows, like maybe he just, his father was really mean to him, and that's why he, kind of does this sort of thing. And all that may be true, right? But in this case, it's functioning as a way to, detract away from the feeling that this person might have about it. So regression is retreating to an earlier, less frustrating period of life and displaying childish and dependent behaviors characteristic of that more secure time. So that might involve, you going home after one of these group meetings, and you just find yourself at the bottom of a 2-liter tub of ice cream, right? And just gobble it all up to feel better, to soothe some of those feelings. Displacement, if an object that satisfies an unconscious impulse is not available, the person may shift the impulse to another object. So the classic example is, you go home and you get frustrated and you smash your laptop, or, you kind of get frustrated and get angry at your friend who's maybe a little bit safer to express some of those feelings with. Sublimation is altering unconscious impulses by diverting them to socially acceptable behaviors. So maybe you decide that you're going to get together a group of students and you're going to form this society for, proper etiquette and, conversing with peers or something like that, something that has some pro-social sort of aspect to it. Real-world example of that would be MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, that sort of thing. So what's interesting, though, and worth keeping in mind is that there's almost an infinite array of different ways that we can, without being aware of it, that we can move away from some distressing feeling or conflict, so we are less likely to experience the full weight of it. There's an interesting book called 101 Defenses, right? I'm sure there's way more than that. And it suggests that, I think, or draws attention to the flexibility of the human being, the plasticity of the human being, that we're able to engage in all this sort of clever, symbolic, feats to avoid engaging with some of this stuff. We can talk about repressive versus tactical defenses. So repressive defenses are defenses that allow us to detach from the experience of an overwhelming emotion. Tactical defenses are defenses that keep another person at a distance so they don't get close enough to, to experience some feeling with this person. So tactical defense, so repressive defenses are more or less some of the things that we've been talking about. A tactical defense would be a person who uses excessive cover words, like real kind of vague words to describe how they're feeling. So you ask them how they're doing, and they'll say, oh, I'm frustrated, right? And the situation is like, well, should be a lot more than that. Or they'll say, how are you doing? And they say, well, I'm upset. What is this feeling? Upset. Well, upset, it's not a really good descriptor. It doesn't give a good sense of what this is. Other kinds of, like, just behavioral kind of maneuvers, like a person will avoid eye contact on anything that involves something of emotional significance. Remember, eye contact is really important because that's in part like how we tune into another person, like we have a sense of their presence with us, and so, but if that has the possibility of intensifying some feeling, then that will be avoided.
Sorry, that was tactical, and what did you say repressive was?
Repressive defenses are defenses that the individual just engages with to just avoid the experience themselves. So like rationalizing, intellectualizing, repression, this kind of thing. They had the same ultimate effect. The ultimate effect is that you get distance from feeling. One is emphasizing the interpersonal part, though. We can also talk about how various emotions themselves can have a defensive function, right? Probably the most obvious, well, what would be an obvious example of that? Like what's one way that one emotion can actually cover over another? Anyone have any thoughts on that? Yeah, so in a situation where your child is in danger or something, you can get just absolutely, frustrated and angry with the kid, but it's really coming from a place of fear, right? Yeah, we could say anger in general is often can often be a defensive emotion, right? And why is that? Well, because of the emotions, like anger is the it doesn't require you to be vulnerable, right? It's a safer emotion in some ways for many people anyway. Right, so rather than opening yourself up to a vulnerability where someone can come in and hurt you or leave you feeling more rejected or dismissed or what have you, anger has the opposite effect. Anger it's pushing the other person away, keeping them at a distance, and ensuring that they're not going to get close enough to you to hurt you again or something like that. There's also or some other ways that this can play out. Shame, in some ways, it's kind of complicated, like a low-grade version of shame, right? So I think as we've talked about, people who struggle with anger, they have a real hard time, kind of dialing into a feeling of anger. What was the feeling that you had toward this person who lied to you, this person who manipulated you, this person who just, kind of left you hanging and seemed to be callous and didn't care at all about your feelings? And then the person says something like, I just feel like I was such an idiot. I shouldn't have trusted this person. I'm just a bad judge of character, right? So in this context, it has the effect of moving away from that feeling. There's this other, really fascinating when it happens, how did you feel toward this person, right? And the response is something like, well, I feel bad for them, right? I feel really terrible for them because I know that they didn't have a good life. I know that, they're just a product of their environment and so on, right? Now, what's wrong with that? What if all that's true, right? What's the issue with that? Yeah. Right. So, well, there's a couple of. So, one is that if you believe that there is such a thing as free will, right? That despite the things that you've experienced, and despite how that may funnel you into a limited range of behaviors and whatnot, there's still possibilities that are available to you, and you are responsible for how they play out, right? So it could be like an avoidance of some of that. The timing, though, right? You can empathize with someone oh, yeah, that's unfortunate that they're this angry mess of a person who just goes around, kind of hurting people, and they don't have a close connected relationship by all accounts. But it's just the timing, right? So we can do that, but not when we're trying to access your feeling of hurt and disappointment or your anger toward this person, right? So it's more the timing that it plays this defensive role. We can talk about how defense mechanisms are adaptive, of course, so they enable or enhance coping. They allow us to deal with less than ideal circumstances. They allow us to kind of put one foot in front of the other to continue functioning, to a certain degree. And they may postpone the experience of anxiety and overwhelming emotion, perhaps indefinitely. So, an individual who has this cluster of defense mechanisms that they're frequently engaging in, they may stay intact for the duration of an individual's life. But there are some that's not always the case, and there's some downsides to this as well. So this would be a good test question, by the way. How are defense mechanisms adaptive? How are they maladaptive? So we could say that they're maladaptive in that they restrict personality. That is, they restrict possible ways of being in the world and being with others. So possible moods and emotions that could show up, that could disclose the world in a particular light, that could, invite another person to connect with you in a particular way. All of that gets closed off, all of it gets restricted. So the world that gets disclosed is constrained or colored in a particular light. It closes off ways of thinking, feeling, and acting. So a person who has a number of defense mechanisms that cluster together in what we might call a dismissing attachment style, right? So that would be a person who, let's say, rationalizes, intellectualizes, engages in repression. They are closed off in a way that it is very difficult for them to experience, vulnerable emotions, and relationships are closed off to them in that more intimate way. A person who has that preoccupied attachment style, where they're kind of swimming in this anxiety and this understanding of their worth as conditional and so on. The world is likewise closed off to them in different ways, where they could experience themselves as an individual of unconditional love and worth to another, right? People who have, this kind of guilt-prone personality, or, there's some shame dynamics at play. There's some interesting things that play out there where, it's those people that have a hard time taking a compliment, right? Do you know those people? Like people, like you say something nice to them and they just immediately shrug it off, or they kind of look away, they get uncomfortable and that sort of thing. Well, in a way, it's like you see this person, you're trying to show them something that you see in them, and you're trying to, for most people that are kind of open, like this is like a nice feeling, right? Like, wow, you see this kind of neat thing about me, or this positive thing about who I am. And it's a reminder, right? It's a reminder of who you are. And it's a nice feeling. But to a person who's closed off or has this sort of, kind of anxiety about their worth and whatnot, it makes them very uncomfortable. And it's almost like they distrust what the other person sees. Like they don't really know you. If you really knew me, you would see something ugly or flawed or what have you. So they get uncomfortable and they kind of push that away. But again, the world that's closed off. Secondly, it operates unconsciously, so it's in the tacit background of our everyday activity. We are unaware that our personality has been restricted, perhaps covering over who we really are. So again, the dismissing attachment style individual is closed off, to all these different ways of relating. Another one is individuals that have like a persona that they seem to identify with. One of the examples is I would frequently go into this store and there would be this person there that would be, we all have met these people, I think, that are just over the top with niceties, just over the top with this flowery, exaggerated, people-pleasing, it's almost like they over-identify with the absolute perfect, social role or something like that. And so, like, we all have like a persona in a way, right? We all put on a bit of a mask or a front, the social expectations or whatever. But these individuals, they get lost in that persona. It's like who they are almost, it's completely based on the social expectations or the familial expectations or what have you. And when you encounter someone like this, it's almost like this eerie feeling, like, did you just win the lottery or something? Like, what's going on here? Do I know you from another life? Like, what's happening here? Like, is there anyone home there? Like, who is this person? And so, important parts of who they are, and get closed off. And, from a Jungian sort of thing, like, they are not at all aware, in tune with their shadow, right? So you wonder, like, okay, what would it take for this person to get angry? Like, you had this thought, like, this person has never been angry in their life, and my God, what are they repressing, and what's going to happen when this comes out, if it ever comes out, right? So again, we're not aware that this stuff has affected us in that way. The adaptive functioning on the third point is only a temporary fix. So defenses can cause distressing symptoms and may crumble under stress. So if a person is engaging in a lot of this, defensive kind of avoidance stuff, it usually does, they usually do pay a price for it. And it usually manifests as chronic tension and anxiety. A person may be just so accustomed to it, they almost don't even notice it. So they may just have like a lot of tension in their shoulders. They could have like, chronic, tension headaches that they just kind of get used to and brush off as just, whatever. Or just this mild anxiety that they always carry with them. But at a certain point, it can actually get quite severe. A person can develop, panic attacks and not have any idea what this is about or where it's coming from. And under a certain amount of stress, this whole kind of thing can crumble or fall apart like a stack of cards. So when defensive habits or strategies break down during times of unusual stress or during therapy, we are stricken with overwhelming anxiety. So when the avoidance strategies break down or they become exhausted by life stress and whatnot, we are then encountering the stress, tension, anxiety, or the underlying feelings. That's a possibility as well, that are habitually avoided. Any questions about any of that? So I was going to give another example. I thought it would be interesting to speak about my own experiences in therapy and my own sort of journey through some of this stuff. And I thought it would be interesting because I can speak to it from the first person perspective, what it's like of encountering some of this stuff, and also from the third person theoretical, like, well, what's going on, and so on. And there's also an interesting temporal unfolding or narrative that kind of speaks to some of the concerns that I have about like different models of therapy and how some of this stuff works. And you'll get a sense of at least one other part of why I have some of the biases that I do, and why I emphasize the necessity of an integrated sort of model of therapy. So like many of you, I had a less than perfect childhood. My mother died when I was a young boy, quite suddenly, and it was something that was never talked about growing up. Before I left elementary school, I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease, and it was something that the treatment for that was quite noticeable. So I was taking prednisone, which makes your cheeks kind of puff up. And there was a period of time where I couldn't eat solid foods, and I had a tube feed. So I had a tube that went in my nose and down into my stomach, and it would be hooked up to a little machine that would kind of whir and pump these. I had this vest that I had to wear with these bags of fluid that would just drip this stuff into my gut. That would prevent all the inflammation and whatnot that was happening. And so all of this was maybe an easy target, for certain kinds of kids, right? So I was teased on a somewhat regular basis, and on rare occasions when I stood up for myself. I was a very small kid. It led to physical altercations that I was not on the winning side of those engagements. So as a kid, I was a very, very sad, very lonely kid, and probably for the better part of a decade, I was suffering with some form of depression. So in my 20s, I eventually sought out help or treatment, and I got connected with someone who I presume was working from more of a cognitive behavioral approach. And so I engaged in maybe 8 sessions with this person, and they helped me notice patterns in my thinking So tendencies toward catastrophizing, just imagining like, situations that are going to unfold in like a worst case scenario. Tendencies to, kind of mind read. Like I thought that I had a really good sense of what other people were thinking of me, and this would kind of lead to some bad things, or, ruminating in a way that would kind of engage in this downward spiral of how I was feeling. So the therapist was able to help me through, just tracking my thoughts and kind of where I was in that way, and helping me challenge some of these, cognitive distortions and this sort of thing. So at a certain point, though, I kind of recognized that, I could do some of this stuff on my own, and I took some books out of the library, and I was reading one in particular. It sounds cheesy, but the Feeling Good Handbook by David Burns. It's actually a decent book if you're in a really bad way and you only have like $5 or something. You pick these things up used. So anyway, through all of that, I was feeling better, or I was feeling less bad. I was no longer meeting criteria for depression, right? So if I was in one of these randomized controlled trials, I'd be a success case, right? And so I was able to function. So I went to university, and I got into psychology through some of this stuff. This is an interesting thing to note. You may know this yourself, that many people who go into psychology, they go into it because they're trying to sort through some of their own stuff, right? And the hope is that if they get into clinical work, that they've sorted through most of it, right? That's the hope. But so I did really well in undergraduate, my undergraduate program. And if you were to ask me at that time, I probably would have told you that I was doing really well, as blah, blah, blah. But in hindsight, looking back, I had, and I was no longer depressed, but I had a tremendous amount of tension and stress that I was carrying in my body. So I mean, like, I was getting like tension headaches, and I was just knotted up in my back and shoulders. And I just brushed that off to, I'm just going to the gym 7 days a week, just overdoing it, blah, blah, blah. The tension stuff is just, I'm up too late, reading too much. Like, just would have totally brushed it off as all that sort of thing. Didn't think anything of it. So that was fine. And I was dating someone for about 3 months, and she had an adventurous spirit. So when I got accepted into graduate school out west, she came with me. So I was moving from one side of the country to the other. I was in a new relationship, and relationships were kind of terrifying for me. And I was in this very intense, stressful program. And so what started to happen is that I started to develop what seemed to be neurological symptoms. So on one side of my face, I started to experience this burning, tingling, crawling sensation, and it went down, one side of my arm. And this is, of course, quite concerning. And so I had an appointment with a neurologist. I did the neurological exam. There wasn't any obvious kind of tracing of a possible lesion in the nervous system or anything like that. And then I was set up for a brain scan. And during this time, I came back to Nova Scotia, and I reconnected with one of my old mentors, someone who had taught me in my undergraduate. She was a neuropsychologist and really intelligent person and well-versed in all kinds of different modes of therapy and whatnot. She knew me fairly well, so we kept in touch during that time, and we sat down for lunch, and I was telling her about this whole thing, and she said, well, I'm going to give you a name, and I want you to take this name, and I want you to check it out and just meet with this person and see how it goes. So she gave me a name of someone who was in Vancouver, and so we were in Victoria. It was 4 hours travel to get to this person. Can you imagine traveling 4 hours to go to your therapist's office, right? So, but thankfully this person allowed for, to make use of that time. We had these 2-hour marathon sessions. And initially he was asking questions just as anyone would ask. Well, when did the symptoms start? And, how are you finding the program? And, how are you dealing with the stress? What is it like, being in the relationship and moving from one side of the country to the other, and blah, blah, blah. And I could imagine that, so this was a psychodynamically oriented person. And I could imagine that someone else working from a different frame would, in a more behavioral sense say, look, you're doing too much, you need to scale this back, maybe you should do some meditation, maybe you should try some of this, and blah, blah, blah. That's not what this person did. And so in the second session, he was asking a bunch of questions about my background and my history and all this other sort of thing. And he was asking me about the death of my mother and what that was like for me and how I felt about it and how, I sort of, processed that in a way over time. And he wouldn't let off this question. And I didn't know why he wasn't letting up on this question. I know now why, right? Because I probably kept steering away from it, or because I wasn't answering very fully, like some of the questions. And at a certain point in our conversation, he says, do you notice how anxious you are right now with me asking you these questions about your mother? And I said, well, what are you talking about? And he said, well, look at your hand. And my hand, I had a death grip on the chair, right? And he said, you have a lot of tension in your chest too. And I tuned into what was happening in my chest, and he was right. It was like all this kind of tightness, right? And my shoulders were kind of up like this. But what was interesting and interesting to kind of speak about from the first person is that I wasn't aware of that anxiety, and when I noticed that, it was almost like this foreign entity. It was almost like something alien showing up that just totally caught me by surprise. You think about that, right? You're attending from your body to the conversation, right? We're just having a conversation. We're having a conversation. We're having a conversation. What's this, right? So it was almost like this ungrounding sort of thing that was a bit disorienting, but he was kind of talking me through this. He was saying, like, look, can't you see that there's all this hurt and loss and sadness related to, to this thing, and this anxiety is coming in, and it's shutting it down. It's covering it over. And what are we going to do about this? Because and he was very supportive but very firm too. He's like, how long are you going to carry this sadness? How long are you going to hold on to this? What's it going to take for you to let this go? And he's saying things like, I can't do this for you. Like, you have to do this. And as long as this wall of anxiety is here, I'm on the outside. I can't help you. I can't connect with you. What are we going to do? And so we kept nudging in this way. And at a certain point, and I realized in that moment, like all this stuff is true. The anxiety let go, and I cried like you wouldn't believe. I've never cried that way in my whole life for what seemed like a good 5 minutes. It seemed like an eternity. It was a whole body sort of experience. And so we had another session or two after that, just kind of processing like all this stuff and different parts of it and other emotions kind of tied to this and how it links into this and that. And but another fascinating part of this is that it was 3 days after that someone said, well, Brad, how are you doing with the kind of neurological thing or whatever? And all the symptoms were gone, right? So it was just this, and I hadn't even noticed that they had just disappeared like that. So it was this fascinating thing. And of course, so that was a process of opening up to different kinds of emotions that I was absolutely closed off to. And it had a dramatic impact on, my relationship. I, eventually married this girl, so there's a happy ending on that front. And obviously played into how I do therapy, right? But I'm laying all that out there in a way because, again, it's emphasizing that background, intuitive, emotional understanding, that way of being in the world, that being closed off. And you can't get to that by just, operating in the mode of conceptual understanding, right? Or just the level of thought, right? That there's a large part of who we are that goes, way beyond that. But hopefully that's clear. But does anyone have any questions about any of that, or things that kind of strike you as interesting or worth talking about? Yep.
Something like imposter syndrome? It's like while you're going to school, do you kind of feel any of that?
I don't think so. No, I think at that point in my life, I was. I think at various points in my life, like the way that I was kind of manifested a little bit like an anxious, I could be in relationships and sometimes in a way that was just absolutely terrifying to me, and I was so afraid of connecting with someone and then losing that relationship or something. And at other times I could just be totally checked out and closed off emotionally, right? And I think at that point in my life I was just pushing through, just doing what you do and this sort of thing. I don't know if I'd call it I wasn't striving to be something to settle some issue of my worth or anything like that, I don't think. Or that wasn't at the forefront, I don't think. But any other questions or thoughts? Yep.
Well, I'm just thinking, like I did the same thing going to psychology, when you start to look into your own life. You don't understand this.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm really interested in the idea of like presenting like some of this stuff in a way that like just the general public can maybe digest a little bit and understand. Like I think there's a way that you could talk about some of these things in, grade school. And that would be a hell of a lot more effective, I think, than teaching them that mental illnesses are chemical imbalances or problems in the nervous system or something like that. But I think we've talked about this in the attachment section, like that in your interpersonal relationships and close friendships, like there's just a flow of this stuff, where if there's the possibility of a feeling, you try to draw it out or you express it if you're the one disclosing that. And what should happen is that there should be some feeling response to that. And if there's not, then I think you have every right to say, well, what's going on here? Does this matter to you at all? Because I don't really get the sense that it does. Or, or how do you feel this mattering? Like, because again, it doesn't seem obvious to me. I think you could do that a little bit and draw someone's attention to it. If a person notices, well, I feel uncomfortable right now. Well, that's a perfect place. So then you could say, like, well, look, isn't that kind of weird that we're just talking about, I'm asking you about your feelings and you're getting uncomfortable? Isn't that kind of weird? Like, don't you see that that's maybe there's something off about that? Like, would that be something that you might want to just figure out and talk about? And I think there's ways that you could do that. So again, we're pushing into the defenses. We're essentially exploring the tacitly avoided background. And I don't know where I got this from, but sometimes like a therapist who's maybe not working from a model like this, like they might intuit on some level that the goal is to not make the client uncomfortable or to not be pushy or to not interrupt, right? But from this model, like you kind of have to sometimes. And the reason is that there's a part of this individual who is, just in the habit of ignoring important parts of their experience. And you as a therapist, like if you think that that's important, like there's a part of you that is really, really important here that you're not paying attention to. And so I have to interrupt you. I have to cut you off and draw attention to this, assuming we're on the same page, that we're in alignment with your goals, what we're trying to do. So it's not just a focus on improved coping with symptoms, it challenges the ongoing pathology that could perpetuate them, though this may take longer, right? So obviously this process could take longer than a few sessions where you're helping a person with kind of breathing, controlled breathing, kind of mindfulness exercises and this sort of thing. Like this is a little bit more involved, and I'm giving like a pretty straightforward. I was ready to. There's a part of me that was ready to kind of let go of some of this stuff. People who had experienced like really severe abuse and severe trauma and whatnot. Like it's not going to go smoothly like that. Like you're talking, months or years in many cases of like really, really hard work to kind of gradually kind of break down some of that defensive wall. So again, the therapist attends to more than just the words. There's a crucial focus on non-conceptual determinants of behavior, anxiety, emotions, nonverbal signs and gestures, interpersonal dispositions, and so on. So again, I've said this before, but like even with some of the third wave CBT approaches that are more explicitly focusing on the body and integrating emotions and things of that nature, in my opinion, there's no other sort of model that is as dialed into the subtle ways that people avoid engaging with parts of their experience. And so that's been just a huge thing for me to learn from some of these short-term dynamic models. Of course, we believe that a client both desires change and unknowingly fears or resists it. So they resist it because that everyday familiar mode of coping was their mode of coping, right? So that's what they've always done. It's safe in a way. It's like the devil that you know. It's familiar, and so to venture into the unknown, to venture into, just possibilities that they've never thrown themselves into. That's a terrifying prospect. So there's a conflict usually within a client. And it's important that, as a therapist, we highlight that the conflict is indeed within the client. So sometimes what can happen is that a client, arguably it's a kind of, a tactical defense of sorts. They become passive, right? And they say things like, well, look, I just can't do what you want me to do, right? Speaking to the therapist in that way. And so immediately the therapist needs to clarify, well, hold on a sec here. Is this something that I want you to do? Does this really, or is this something you want to do? And I'm just an extension of your will, or that whatever part of you wants to work on these things that we've laid out as worth working on. I love this quote as it relates to trauma by Robert Stollerow. Trauma is constituted in an intersubjective context in which severe emotional pain cannot find a relational home in which it can be held. In such a context, painful affective states become unendurable, that is, traumatic. Now, what's significant about that, it's not that someone had experienced something that is, quotes, objectively traumatic or something like that does the damage. You can experience some horrific situation, and as long as you have a place where you can go, where you can, experience those feelings in the presence of a caring other, and you can feel that mattering to this other person, and you can, tolerate that feeling, there's a good chance that the experience will not be traumatic, right? So someone who had been sexually abused in childhood by a non-family member, but it's quickly discovered and addressed, and the family is emotionally available. They're not in this sort of rage and whatnot and tied up in their own stuff. They're able to really tune in to what's happening with that child and how they're doing and the impact and so on. They're probably going to be okay, or they're going to be way more likely to be okay than this sort of thing happening within the family, right? That's going to be like a really awful scenario. This book, by the way, is an amazing book. It ties together all the best parts, I would say, of psychodynamic or contemporary psychoanalytic thought with some existential theorizing, and I'm just fascinated with this author. So if you want something that really kind of covers a lot of things that we've been covering, like this would be a really cool book to pick up. I want to show another example of what some of this might look like. You guys might have seen this film. I'm going to show maybe 12 minutes or something from it, and we'll just talk about some of the themes there. So just to set this up a little bit, this is Good Will Hunting. Will, like the main character, is one of these guys who had been abused as a kid. He'd been through the foster care system and whatnot. He has arguably like an avoidant sort of attachment dynamic. He pushes other people away and so on. And this is just, I'm piecing together little snippets of sort of the therapy sort of unfolding, and it leads to, a bit of a climax toward the end. So we'll just check that out. So I like that clip because we can quibble about the appropriateness of some of what's happening between the client and the therapist and so on, right? We can definitely do that, but I think it illustrates at the end that bit where he's saying it's not your fault, right? And initially, what comes back? What's that? I know. Now, on what level is he knowing?
In his tacit way of dealing with the world normally.
I would say he knows conceptually, like he knows intellectually, I would say. Would we agree with that? Would we say that? So he knows, like factually, like he knows that that's the case. He knows it's not his fault in that way. Is he feeling the significance of it, though, in that moment? No, he's not. So and what comes back? Like, what do you notice, like, when Robin Williams' character is kind of pursuing that? What starts to show up non-verbally? What do you see in... There's signs of anxiety there, yeah? And how do you know there's signs of anxiety? What's that?
No eye contact.
So there's some avoidance, right? The breaking away of eye contact. But there's a smirk there too, right? And so the smirk, like there's nothing funny about this, right? And so it betrays like that discomfort. There's anxiety there. So he's not getting it. He's not able to, reckon with what that means. It's a significance emotionally. And so, they presumably they have enough of a rapport with one another that, again, the therapist is able to kind of push that a little bit and push through that anxiety, and there's this emotional opening up. So just a couple points here. Just on that note, rapport and the importance of the therapeutic relationship, this is absolutely crucial. So to do this kind of emotional work, like you have to have a really solid rapport with someone that they would, you would give someone else the permission to make you uncomfortable and to hold your attention to something that is quite painful. You need to have a solid rapport. Just on freedom and responsibility in therapy, I've been really fascinated about this. We'll get into this next time, maybe a little bit. We're going to talk about free will and determinism. It should be an interesting conversation. But there is like the responsibility, for getting better or, moving forward, doing something different, opening oneself up to novel possibilities. That lies for the most part with the client, right? When you think about like what happens in therapy, it's not like the therapist's words cause in some, efficient sense, like it causes the person to be symptom-free or something like that. What the therapist is doing is inviting them to engage with something that they tend not to notice, but it's up to the client whether they are going to be able to hold their attention to that which they habitually avoid. And if they can move themselves into an experience that is less familiar to them. So that's really important. So the client's will to do therapy is absolutely crucial. So in order for any of this to be effective, there has to be a strong will to overcome some of these issues. So again, the importance at the very outset, like, well, why is this worth doing? Like, why do we take up this task here? Like, what's at stake if we are not successful? And if the person just says, well, I'm just curious, I read about this stuff in a book or saw it in a movie and I just thought I'd go give it a try. Well, that's probably not really enough, like if there's something difficult that we need to do, like there has to be that motivating force that is going to allow you to tolerate something uncomfortable to get through to the other side of it. I'm not going to linger there on that one. What else did I want to talk about? Oh, I did want to talk about, we'll skip the masochist sadist type thing, but when we're talking about relationships and trust and emotional trust and affairs and whatnot, some people ask like, well, why did this affair happen? Like, why did this person cheat on me and this sort of thing? And I think a better question to ask is, well, what prevents people from cheating? I think that's a better question. And my intuition about that is that a person who is open within themselves and they're really tuned into their partner's feelings, that's what prevents people from engaging in this stuff, because they have this intuitive understanding, assuming you're in a monogamous relationship, right? And there's this mutual understanding that that's what it is. the moment the thought even crosses your mind, you have these pangs of guilt, right? That would be betraying like the ideal of who I am. So there's a feeling related to that. And there's the feeling of empathy in terms of what that would do to this person that you care about. If they were to see, what you were entertaining, in your mind or, thinking about engaging with and so on. So if you're dialed into all of those emotions and in your relationship, and again, there's this mutual agreement that you're in a monogamous relationship, it's highly unlikely that those sorts of things will happen. So in my experience, like these things usually happen because a person is, again, like closed off in different ways or not in tune with these feelings that would show up. Yeah. One of the things I wanted to talk about here was, so with all these different approaches, like there's grains of truth to, I think all of them, but even within some of the short-term dynamic approaches, there can be a kind of dogmatic component to it that I think is worth just mentioning here. So certain approaches, they're based on a model that maybe intuits or prioritizes one realm of emotional experience over others. So an example of that would be the intensive short-term dynamic psychotherapy model. And on that model, repressed anger or rage is a really important component of this. So the idea is that if you're suffering from some intractable kind of mental health issue, then it's likely a result of certain traumas or neglect or something like that, and repressed anger or rage that you have toward the parental figure for abandoning you or hurting you or something like that. So the core of that model is all about getting at repressed anger or rage. And it's interesting that in asking certain questions of the client, you kind of corner them into particular kinds of responses. So for example, if you say, so this situation unfolded, there's a parent who was mistreating or being neglectful or whatever, and you ask the client, what was the feeling toward the parent for neglecting you, right? Now if I frame it in that way and I say, what is the feeling toward them, right? How many options are there? Not many options, right? There's basically anger, right? The feeling toward them, or I suppose in some weird way you could say, well, I love them, I'm appreciative that they neglected me or something like that. So now, a different approach would be, well, what was that like for you? Like, how did you feel about that? That's a little bit more open-ended. But then it may not get at the anger component, right? So so in these models, like if you look at like a manual of this stuff, there's all these kind of entries on anger and rage and hardly anything about other kinds of emotions like shame, which is kind of interesting. So the short-term dynamic models, the intensive short-term dynamic psychotherapy is focused mostly on adults, but they don't seem to tie this back into like a developmental trajectory. Like I think they imagined that there was this repressed rage or anger. I was fortunate enough that a lot of my early work I did with children who were, in the foster care system. They were abused, neglected, and so on. And what you see is not repressed anger and rage. That's actually the main emotion that shows up, right? That these kids are just constantly raging and hitting people and yelling and screaming. Like that's their normal go-to emotion, right? There's like a pressure cooker type thing, and that's how it comes out. It seems to me, and I think with other theorists who had that experience working with children, it's actually repressed shame that is the main emotional component there. So the anger or the rage is almost like, kind of keeping the other person at arm's length or at a distance that they don't ever get to know them in a more intimate way. Now the intensive short-term dynamic model, interprets shame in a different way. For them, shame is just this superficial kind of, self-attack or something like that. I wouldn't call that shame. I would call that like sham shame or something like that. That's not the feeling of shame. The feeling of shame is just this annihilating, awful, terrible feeling. But those are just some interesting things to to keep in mind. But okay, I think we'll wrap up there, and we'll see you guys back here next week.